Hi, hello. So, this is the start of a new series of videos. If you are hearing some buzzing sound in the background, sadly it's a AC going on, and I cannot do really anything special about that. So, one question of the BMC community was how to access the grid object we have in BMC. So, we have a grid object. But for example, when we display a grid, we don't. For example, you don't have the possibility to automatically select the first row, for example. So that's the kind of thing we do not provide, or we do not provide some APIs for the user to play with. For example, to refresh the grid. We have an action for that, but we might not have other APIs. So we are using under the hood UI grid. That is a component that you can find on the internet, which has a ton of APIs, which has a ton of tutorials. So our grid is based on this one. So if you want, you can get the grid API object from one of our grid object and play around with it. And so for example, here, if I select row number 1, which is the second one because it begins at 0, you can see that I can click in here, I can just select one row. So how is it working under the hood? So here we have a custom REST API that is, a custom view component that is access grid. So as a custom view component, it accepts two things. One is row index, so this one, and another one is a grid object. So the grid object is simply this grid. So if you look inside Innovation Studio, so you can see that this view component is accepting this record grid directly. So here you just give the object record grid. And this one, the row index, is simply this integer field from whatever form. It's just the information you want. So this will pass the row, and this passes the object. So what do you do with the object? So in your directive, what you just need to do is you get your object. So you are taking your grid object, so which is this parameter, which is our grid object. So you check that you have a grid object. You check that you have a get UI grid API. That is a function method from this object. And what you do is that you just try to get the grid API object from UI grid using an async. So the reason you do that is because it can be like a race. So when you display your page, when you display your view, so here you have your custom view component. The custom view component might load before the grid is loaded. So if you just call this init function and your grid is not yet loaded, you might just have nothing. So the goal is basically to watch the content of grid object, and when you have the grid object, you call this function, this method, and then when you get your object, what you want to do is you have to wait that the object becomes completely initialized to get the APIs for it. So anyway, long story short, you get the grid API object, and then when you click on the button, when you click on the button, this one, so it's on here in the directive. When you click on the button, we click on select row, and select row is going to call this method, and this method is going to get the index, so the number you want to, the row ID you want to select, And if you have the grid API object, you simply call the method selection select row by visible index. And this method is actually one from UI grid. So it might be in the API. So here you just, so the idea is that you manage to get the grid API. So you will have access to all the APIs from the UI grid object. And then you just call these APIs from UI grid. And this example is just to select a specific row. So here if I change, I put 2, it's going to select number 2. So this is really a quick example. So you need to be careful because we are using some events that are plugged for our own logic. So if you are using for like your own events, you might override some of the BMC events. So you will just have to play along and see what you're breaking or not. But anyways, that's how you get the grid API, and you can do something with it. So someone on the BMC community managed to automatically select one row when the grid loads. The thing is, when you load the view, it's going to load the grid object first, and then it's going to load the data. So here in this example, we have the grid API object, but if immediately you try to select the first row, it might not work because the object might be here, but no data might be here. So you have to wait for the data to be here. So for that, please check the BMC community, or I might do another video, maybe more in depth with the grid API if you want it. So anyway, that's all for this video.